have the same paper for each individual sheet, or care necessarily that all of them matched. So you could have pages from very different points in the printing process that go into the same book because they're all being stored separately before the book gets built, if that makes sense. Here's a copy in Munich. You can see that it used to have this same either Lucretia or Justice in the middle before some jerk, who was probably a Duke of Bavaria, had their coat of arms stamped over it in gold.
Just to deface it?
To mark it as being part of the library. This one comes from the State Library of Bavaria, which used to be the Royal Library, and before that was the Ducal Library. There are also many copies that are not bound in leather. This is a parchment binding. Parchment would be sort of like a paperback book today, but parchment is extraordinarily durable because parchment is not made of paper. Parchment is a weird kind of leather. So it's made of animal skins that you have to stretch out and sort of treat with chemicals, but you end up with a substance that's similar to paper in that you can write on it, but it's almost impossible to destroy or damage. It's basically waterproof, it's largely fireproof. So it's a pretty good protection for a book if you can't afford to use wooden boards and leather. And this one, someone painted their coat of arms on the parchment. Yeah.
Out of curiosity, why, if parchment is so much more durable, why would we switch?
Cost.
Cost?
So
Yeah.
parchment is an animal skin, which means for every 8 pages of a parchment book, more or less, you have to slaughter a whole animal. So making books, and especially mass-producing books, only became possible once we had really cheap paper. So that's when Europeans switched to linen rag paper. They would still use parchment for things, but medieval parchment books were extremely expensive just because of the cost of all the individual animal skins that went into it. Interestingly, so they would use goats or sheep or calves, young cows, which were all approximately the same size. So we had this standard size of how big a piece of writing surface you can extract from a skin. And you still see that today if you've ever seen European paper sizes like A4 and A5. Those are based on the scale of the parchment pages they would get from an animal skin. Has carried forward even to now. Our American 8.5 by 11 sheets are also very similar to what you get if you take an animal skin and divide it into 8 sheets of paper. So yeah, this was an amazing material. It's way more durable than papyrus, which they used before parchment really caught on, or paper, but it's just so expensive.
It's basically like a natural polymer.
Yeah, it's, and really there's no way you can really replicate it synthetically that anyone has come up with. It's just a strange, interesting, useful piece of material. And they would have to raise, herds and herds of animals just to get their skin to make these kinds of books. Curiously, they had paper in China much, much earlier than in Europe, but the Chinese could only make it out of a certain kind of tree that wouldn't grow in Europe. So the process they were using to make paper was not replicable, and the Europeans had to reinvent paper from scratch. So European paper was completely different from Chinese paper, and they had to use different ink and everything because of the different properties. The history of paper is a whole other complicated world. Yeah.
Do you know what like the early like actual
Those are parchment. Yep. Parchment was paper doesn't really take over for parchment until between 1350 and 1450. You see a sea change. Although parchment remains a high class material even into like the 16th, 17th century. They were still making parchment books, but only if you were rich and could afford it. Paper is what made books affordable to the middle class for the first time, really. And there's a whole interesting history lesson in all of that. The things that actually allowed the creation of cheap books in Europe was a whole bunch of really unrelated factors. What else we got? Oh no. No. Show coming in the next slide. There we go. There were also velvet bindings. If you wanted a fancy prestige binding and didn't care how durable it was, you'd use fabric. So this is a red velvet copy of Meyer that is currently in Moscow, which I believe they looted from Berlin during World War II, along with a bunch of other stuff. And this one is interesting because it actually has a personal dedication from Meyer into him. We'll come back to that. But Meyer probably also is the one who commissioned the red velvet bindings. So, the thing everyone remembers about Meyer's books is the pictures, right? You've all seen pictures like this. And this is the way we're used to looking at them. These sort of sanitized, black and white, cleaned up pictures, sometimes zoomed in on a single individual in them. What the actual book looks like usually is more like this. Not quite as neat, not quite as tidy, definitely not as clean. But, sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. But what's actually more interesting, I've come to learn over the course of this project, is that many of them look more like this. Because it turns out that the black and white pictures that we're used to seeing are not what people historically wanted out of their books. They look at that kind of art as being unfinished. Because if you've ever seen a medieval manuscript, they are full of bright colors and tons of decoration. They're really elaborate. And that was the idea of what pictures should be like. They should be colorful. It's sort of like how we're all used to seeing these white marble Greek and Roman statues. Then you find out, oh no, they used to paint their statues to look like people. The paint just wore off over time. Until today, there's no more paint left for most of them. In this case, many copies of Meyer have paint. And there was a whole class of workers who were called letter painters or illuminators, whose job was to take the black and white prints and apply color to them. The lower class ones were called Briefmaler or Kartmaler because the first ones, the earliest printed objects that would get painted were playing cards or like little handbills. So card painters would do that, and then book painters come much later as we get more larger prints. So here we have an unpainted painter and a painted painter. The copy in Moscow is not quite as nice as the one I just showed you. This copy is the one that Meyer commissioned himself to have painting in it, but you can see still lots of bright colors. We know that Meyer commissioned this because he has a handwritten dedication in the book. It was dedicated to the Duke of Saxony, who had a young son, who Meyer was probably angling to get a teaching contract for. The kid was like 10 in 1570, and would have just been about the right age to teach fencing when Meyer finished in Mecklenburg. But it's got some nice gold lettering, and a professional fancy scribe did the writing for this copy dedicated to a duke. And obviously has the nice painting. Other copies are more like this. This is an incomplete paint job in the Rostock copy where they didn't actually get through all the color application for reasons we don't really understand. There's also really terrible painted ones like this one. It almost looks like a kid got to it with finger paints. Some of the coloration is not very nice at all. And of course, there's a copy in Leuven where somebody added blood splatter to all the rapier plates. Anytime it looks like a sword is touching a human, they added a blood fountain. I love that one. There's a couple dagger ones too. Different approach to coloring. Yeah.
If these books were often given to nobles with kids, right? I'm speculating. Is it possible that kids would like vandalize it like that?
There are plenty of cases of books that have been doodled in by children over the years. Yeah, totally a thing that happened. 133 has crayon scribble in it.
Children and cats.
Yeah, the Ludwig von Abe manuscript has like doodled people in the margins. I have a different lecture I give where I have a really great one on the slide of that one. Yeah, it happens. There are copies of Meyer that might have been doodled in by kids. But like I said, everybody loves these pictures. There are several copies where people put indexes of the pictures. They wrote them into the copies so they could find the pictures easier. Some of them have tabs like this of where all the pictures are, kind of like a Bible, but of just Meyer's pictures to make them easier to find. People would sometimes draw their own pictures in. This is a copy in Vienna, I think, where someone did all this elaborate sketch work on the fly leaves. And in fact, that one, they were copying a different print by hand into their book. This print is in the National Library of France. They don't know where it came from, or like what the origin of it is, or who made it. But they have this, and then we discovered the exact same thing in this copy in Vienna. And like I said, doodles sometimes. Here somebody has clearly tried to copy down his foot in the lower margin. And I'm not sure quite what they were doing with this one over here. This is the copy at the Folger Shakespeare Library. I think maybe they started trying to draw this guy's head, and they just added a triangle for a body. And this is the copy in the Met in New York. Oh, you want to take a picture of that? Okay. People often also would add labels to the pictures in their books. Here are two copies that have handwritten labels in the lower margins, in Bamberg and Bern, labeling the guards specifically. The copy in Munich, someone wrote Zornhut in the Dusak here. And this copy, again at the Met, they wrote the name of the guard in the guy's pants. Eisenpforte, or Iron Gate. People also took the errata in the back of the book where they listed all the corrections, and they actually implemented it in the text, so a lot of copies have all the corrections made by hand. And in this case, someone scribbled out the corrections after they finished, so they knew they were done. There's a copy, I want to say it's in Göttingen, that has a handwritten statement that's possibly written by Joachim Meyer, saying that he made the book. And there's another copy that has a little tiny printed slip glued over the printer's statement that has Meyer's name instead of Thibault Berger's. So it should look like this. Geht's zu Strasbourg by Thibault Berger on Weinmarkt zum Trubel. So printed in Strasbourg by Thibault Berger. And instead, Meyer, it's covered up with this thing that says, printed in the workshop of Joachim Meyer, free fencer and Berger of Strasbourg. So probably Meyer did that himself, but we don't really know. And he clearly wanted to take extra credit for this book, even though he wasn't a printer. All he did is pay for it, which I guess would make him the publisher, but not the printer. And we have this one, which I just found pretty recently, where someone was doing Latin homework in the empty space. This one says, Oculus ist ein Auge, which means Oculus is eye, and they drew a picture of an eye. And then Lumpus, Lumporum, und Lex, Dant, Tibi, something I can't read. They were just writing down random Latin phrases. But this is the best because it just says, telling you what Oculus means in German. With a visual aid. You know, the idea of keeping a book nice and pristine was not really how they thought about things in previous centuries. Alright, how am I doing for time, by the way? I don't know if someone's in this room after me. I've got 7 minutes. I'm going to try and speed run some slides. 100 Ungerot. Someone copied down a bunch of stuff from his fencing manual into a copy of Meyer. Here in the cover, they put all the poems that he quotes in Latin and German, and they also